Welcome everyone to another Cork Humanists meeting. It's good to see some familiar faces. On the news front, we currently don't have a meeting organised for next month, but stay tuned on that front. In terms of the meeting that we won't have today, I'd ask that you put your phones on silent.
Sorry, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to remind me, thank you so much. And in terms of the humanism news in general, at the moment there's I suppose the most interesting thing happening at the moment is rumblings within the HEI regarding the Civil Registration Amendment Act 2002. The story there is, I'll try to put it as briefly as possible. Basically, for the past 10 years, the HEI have been campaigning so that their celebrants can solemnise marriages just like the religious. In order to solemnise marriages, they had to sign a document saying that they were a religion, and on principle they didn't sign it. So, if you wanted to get a humanist celebrant, you could have the celebration in your garden, but then you had to go to the registry office and get it signed. So that would be the actual legal solemnisation of your marriage would be at the Civil Registration Office. Basically, then the HEI campaigned and got Joan Burton and Ivana Bacek, the atheist activist extraordinaire, to draft some legislation which was put forward. They did a great job, and then the civil servants got their hands on it. And they took it a section from the Charities Act, which states that charities cannot promote a political cause unless it is directly related to their aims. Now, the civil servants, for whatever reason, I'm not going to go into that now, they actually took out the second clause, so now the HEI is not able to promote a political cause. Now, Andrew Radigan, one of our fellow HEI members, took issue with this, and he posted a letter on Atheist Ireland, which you can look up, basically calling for an EGM and saying we've kneecapped ourselves, we can't be politically active anymore if we sign up to this act. The board were very dubious, and they actually sent out a letter to every HEI member in the country, and they gave their own side, which was very biased, and had a ballot enclosed which asked the members to endorse their own position. Most people signed yes, because of course you would after reading such a biased document. And then Andrew sent out his letter then. But luckily Andrew has got the letters back. He's got the necessary 10%, and EGM is going to happen. And basically what he proposed was that we just have a discussion about it. Discussion is good. We're all, reasonable people. The board is trying to clamp down on the discussion of this. In terms of where the Cork Humanists is coming from, Andrew's letter has basically been a focal point, a rallying cry for people who are disenfranchised within the humanist movement in Ireland. And we've got together and we've set up a HEI reform group, and we're going to, the fifth motion that Andrew proposed was the election of new officers. So a couple of us are going to run, and hopefully we'll get numbers on the board and we'll start making real changes. Like the Cork Humanists actually becoming a branch of the Humanist Association of Ireland. Personally, where I'm coming from I'm going to be pushing the reform agenda. I'll be standing personally, and if anybody would be interested in becoming a board director of the Humanist Association of Ireland, you can come up and talk to me afterwards. Believe me, it's not as big a deal as you think it is. I had a lot of respect for any national board of directors, like you think, like, oh wow, the board of directors, they got to know what they're doing. Believe me, that is truly not the case. I realised that over the course of 2 years. So hopefully, all that would be involved would be travelling up to Dublin every 6 weeks to attend the board of directors meeting, and then hopefully after 3 or 4 meetings we'll have a conference call system set up, and we can all have a meeting outside from various different locations all over the country, which would make HEI a truly national organisation. Sorry, I usually am not that long-winded, but it's just kind of the news that's happening at the moment, and we'll probably have serious repercussions for the history of humanism into the future. I'll probably send out an email in that regard because it's just so complicated. Hopefully, and it will include more detail. Okay, so getting to the main event. I have been looking forward to this talk for ages. I'm a bit of a fan of Colm's for setting up the Cork Sceptics. I've gone to a few meetings. I really respect what he does. When did we meet?
Was it 2 years ago?
Was it Dan Dennis?
Yeah.
It was Dan Dennis, yeah. It was Dan Dennis. Which is a big event in Cork, it was great. So, without further ado, Colm Ryan.
Don't clap yet. You may not be clapping, but I want to take back your claps later on. Yeah, I'm going to kind of talk about this. It's fairly open, but I was going to call it the Tales of the Bad Skeptic, you know, because I'm just going to give an idea about how I got into this, you know, and maybe talk a little bit about skepticism as well, and some of the events and Cork Sceptics and some of the interesting speakers and speeches that we've had over the last couple of years. I mean, I don't think I'm that different from a lot of people I've met who have been involved in skepticism for a long time. When I was a teenager, I was into UFOs, and I was into pyramids, and I was in, you know, this pyramids, you put a piece of cheese underneath a pyramid, it's meant to keep it perfectly preserved. Cosmic joke was another one, you know, that God has his way of giving you signs in the sky and all this kind of stuff. And there was magazines around in the early 80s, you know, Tales of the Unexplained and all this kind of stuff, which really, you know, made you think, wow, you know, life is really crazy, and it's got, you know, all this stuff that's happening that we don't realise, and, you know, everything's a big conspiracy theory. And this really, I was eating this stuff up when I was a teenager. And but on one other side, I was also very interested. I was a bit of a geek. I was very interested in maths and science, and it was something that I had, you know, I would be, you know, loved maths, you know. And that's kind of a strange thing to say, but it was one of those things that I kind of got, and it was something that I loved when I was in secondary school and all the rest of it. And I loved science as well, stars, planets, anything to do with that. So it was a bit of a juxtaposition, and there was one guy who wrote some really, really good books on maths and kind of problems and stuff like that. He used to write for Scientific American, and his name was Martin Gardner, very, very well known individual. He used to kind of give people logic puzzles to solve, and a lot of it was very, very good. And I bought a couple of his books. But one book I bought of his was quite different. It was this one, I still have it. It's called Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science. And when I was reading through it, he basically blew to pieces all of this pyramidology and biorhythms and homeopathy and everything. Just went through every single one of these kind of ideas with a fine-tooth comb, and was saying this in alternative medicine, you know, that's great, but you need to understand this and you need to understand that. And essentially he introduced me to skepticism at the age of about 19 or 20. It was a real eye-opener. I mean, to me this was more interesting than all that stuff about, you know, flying saucers and all this stuff. You know, really it was proper criticism of that whole genre. And this was written in 1956. This is a very, very old book on the subject, much, much earlier than what we call the sceptical movement. And, you know, another thing was interesting, Loch Ness Monster, you know, so I went to Loch Ness and it was looking, you know, binoculars and all the rest of it. And I also picked up another book at the time, and, you know, again, just kind of, you know, it was a critical reading of the whole Loch Ness phenomenon. It was basically saying, you know, there's a surgeon up in Scotland who's laughing, must have been laughing every single day because of he produced that iconic picture of the kind of the head of the Loch Ness Monster. And, like, that was, you know, the main reason why everybody was talking about a plesiosaur in Loch Ness. And, you know, here was a guy here was another book which basically blew it all apart and said, you know, this is just a modern cultural phenomenon. And what's interesting, I got really into it. I started saying, wow, this is kind of interesting that there's a whole, and you see, you know, when it comes to UFOs and alien visitations and Bigfoot and all this stuff, you only need to turn on the television. You only need to turn on the television any day to see people parrot this stuff off. To actually find out stuff that's critical or that takes another, an alternative, you will not see that. Almost never. on television. You never see that in a lot of popular cultural magazines and stuff like that. Scepticism is one of those things that certainly back in the 80s was something you'd never hear about, and even today it wouldn't be something.
I think people think it's almost like spoiling the fun.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, as if we're kind of big spoiled sports.
Yeah,
exactly. But I found it really interesting that there was a kind of another angle being presented with all this. But I was interested in skepticism. I was also very, very deeply committed Christian, very, very, very strong Catholic at the time. Got offended by the life of Brian. Remember that? Yeah, that was me, right? So I was really, really strongly, and I, even all the way through college, I would have gone to mass every single Sunday and everything like that. So I would always call myself a bit of a bad skeptic, you know what I mean? If it wasn't for the fact that I'd maybe read some of these books, I'd probably be a priest or something. But I also, when I was in college, I think there was just the kind of things were beginning to break down. That kind of, you know, strong indoctrination that I had when I was a kid was beginning to break down. I got interested in Carl Sagan. He wrote a great novel called Contact. I don't know if you've seen it. That's all about, you know, communicating with aliens and all this stuff.
They made a movie with Jodie Foster in it.
Yeah, it's exactly the same one. Yeah, his book was superb. If you have never read that book, Contact, even if you've seen the film, the book itself is really, really wonderful. And you know, again, he was poking a little bit at maybe some of the kind of preconceived notions that I would have had, and and then I was in America. I went to America for a J1 over in Ohio, and a guy was driving me to work. You know, I never heard of creationism until I went to Ohio. And the guy driving me to work he had a radio on. I think he was trying to, he was quite a very nice guy. I think he was silently trying to indoctrinate me into Southern Baptist preaching. And he had these Baptist preachers, and they were going, there's no law in any book, there's nothing, you know, all the information you need to know is in the Bible. You know, this is, you know, one of the root doctrines of Southern Baptism. And I just couldn't believe that people out there actually believed that the world was created in 7 days and it all happened 6,000 years ago. You know, that again really caused me to kind of really question what the hell was going on. And I didn't become non-religious until after college. You know, I didn't actually, you know, it was one of those kind of, what do you call it, Damascene kind of, you know,
Road to Damascus.
Yeah, kind of road to Damascus type of thing, where, you know, suddenly a friend of mine, said to me, we were having this big discussion on a boat coming back from France, and a bit of drink involved, and he said to me, you know, do you think that there would ever be such a thing as robot intelligence? You know, well, this is the kind of stuff I was talking about, you know. But anyway, it was a lot of drink. But he says, I said, yeah, I think somewhere along the way, you know, you could actually potentially build a machine that, you know, even nowadays we have machines that can kind of mimic human intelligence in some ways. So we're getting there. So I said, yeah, why not? You know, what if you do if you turn it off? You know, it was like, does it go to heaven? It was like, of course not. Of course not. Just be stupid. You know, think about that one. You know, and actually it did. It was one of those things that just enough kind of straw on the camel's back to make me realise, hold on a second. Hold on a second, you know. So I became quite irreligious very, very quickly after that, that's all I can say. And, you know, it was all really, it didn't start it, you know, to get interested in this and kind of questioning a lot of kind of what I'd been brought up to understand, what I'd been led to understand or believe when I was all the way through school. I read a lot more Carl Sagan, and this is another book that I came across in the mid-90s, which is The Demon Haunted World, where Carl Sagan, does anybody not know who Carl Sagan is? He was an astronomer who, he was a very, very well-educated man, was involved in the nuclear project in, you know, the post-war nuclear kind of, you know, bringing up, but also as an astrophysicist, and he was involved in a lot of the kind of, America made huge leaps of kind of understanding the universe, and he was also very heavily involved in the Voyager craft that went out to Jupiter and Neptune and is currently departing from the solar system as we speak. So he had a huge, very, very well-respected scientist, but he wrote this book in the 1990s saying, you know, the world's going a bit crazy. He says that this UFO thing and this kind of Bigfoot thing and alternative medicine and alternative lifestyles and everything, naturopaths and everything like that, it's really beginning to take over. It's beginning to really get a beachhead in national consciousness. And he was worried that this is going to affect the education of kids. That people weren't aware of this. That these people, that there was alternative ideas and alternative therapies, and they were starting to move into the universities. They were starting to become considered to be like mainstream education. And he was saying, listen, we want to watch it because we've spent the last 2,000 years as a civilization getting away from that, you know, and people are blindly walking into a post-scientific society and back into magic again, you know, that's the magical thinking and magical ideas. This is a really good book, by the way, and some of it is shocking. He talks about the Orkney child abuse case, if anybody's ever heard of that. This group of people in Scotland who believed that children were being taken away by satanic cults in the middle of the night and that they were being abused and all this stuff. They actually got caught on so much that social workers came along, grabbed the children from the houses and relocated them without say-so from the parents. And once it was realised that the whole thing was complete rubbish, that it caused a huge amount of thinking. And he said, that's witchcraft. He says, just witch hunting has just reappeared, and we have to be very, very much on the lookout for it. So some of it, but it is an excellent book, and it does kind of set down these two books really in many ways. They set down the basis of what Scepticism is all about, giving people an understanding about what the key issues in Scepticism are. It has moved on quite a way, and I'll kind of get back into it. The other thing as well is that I was big into Douglas Adams. Anybody know who Douglas Adams is? You know, I have a huge interest in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and all of these books that he's written. He was a remarkable mind who was also a very, very strong skeptic. I often think, you know, the skeptic movement really took off just after he died, and I think that's a terrible shame, you know, because he was a very, very strong skeptic. And a lot of his books really is kind of a send-up of, you know, lazy thinking really, in terms of how that whole thing happens. Another person as well, I think, who was very highly influential on me was James Randi. Now, James Randi is a magician. He's not a scientist. He's a magician. But that's a picture of him there. He's a small little man. He's about that high. He's in his 80s now. But Randi was very, very skeptical, and very skeptical of, you know, all sorts of kind of alternative claims. You know, his basic view is that, you know, there's no evidence for some of these people. He's a magician, and one of the things about magicians is that they get very irritated by psychics. They don't like psychics very much. The reason is that they're doing the same stuff that psychics do, except they're saying, hey, it's all a trick, guys. It's all a trick. I'm tricking you. Whereas the psychics say, really, the magical powers exist. They really do exist. I'm kind of manipulating your brains, and, you know, there's all this stuff going on. Whereas the magician says it's a trick. But they get very annoyed because they're using the same parlor tricks. The psychics are using the same parlor tricks as the magicians do. And he wrote a number of books. Flim Flam is one of them. Faith Healers is another. He had a blog called Swift. I think it's still going, where he used to deconstruct a lot of these kind of claims and say, you know, all of this is happening. He was pretty much on his own during the 1990s, and then he set up big conferences called TAM, the Amazing Meeting, because he's called the Amazing Randy, is his kind of is his thing. He also, one of the interesting things about Randy is that he fooled a whole lot of scientists. There was a big experiment going on, I think it was in the 1960s, in one of the universities in America, where they were trying to. The scientists believed that they had now evidence that extrasensory perception, you know, psychic powers existed. They had basically said, yeah, we've written up the paper, we've done the experiments, we really do think ESP exists. And Randy got got information about this, and him and a couple of other magicians decided that they were going to sabotage the experiment by essentially showing, pretending to them that the psychic powers existed, and then when they had published the paper, or when they had basically said yes, psychic powers existed, basically doing a big denouement and saying, no, it was all trickery. And he got quite notorious, but what he actually proved was that scientists can be fooled. Which was a very, very big statement. Scientists needed to really, really watch their experimental procedures, because if they didn't, somebody who knew what they were doing could actually fool them. So it was a big kind of opening up of, where the scientists realized, we can learn something from these magicians. They really know how the human brain works. They certainly have a good idea about how the human brain can be fooled, otherwise they wouldn't be in their profession. And so he has become a little bit of a kind of a hero of the skeptical movement, because he has been very forthright about psychics and frauds and everything like that, and he's gone out on a limb to make sure that somebody say, Uri Geller, I don't know if any of you remember Uri Geller.
Yeah.
He was the arch nemesis of Uri Geller. He'd do things like Uri Geller would say, I can bend spoons and all the rest of it, and then he would say, fine, let's go on to the Johnny Carson's show, and let's see if Uri Geller can bend spoons in a specially controlled experiment, and Uri Geller could never do it, and it was like, oh yeah, it's not a good day, or maybe the lights are too bright or something like that. He was, Randy is a bit of a kind of a hero really to the skeptical movement, and he's still very active. I hope I'm as active as him when I reach the age of 84.
Isn't there a fund, isn't there? Or the James Randi?
The James Randi Educational Foundation, yeah, it just helps to kind of...
They have €1 million or $1 million
the $1 million
prize for it.
That's right. So they're basically saying, if you have psychic powers, you genuinely believe you've got psychic powers, or that the supernatural exists, come along and talk to us, and we'll set up an experiment with your consent as to what the procedures are going to be. We will go through exactly what the procedures are, and then we will test your skills. And and as a person who believes in it, you're encouraged to believe that all of this. You're encouraged to. You need to accept that the procedures are right. We're not going to do anything that would be kind of, smoke and mirrors or anything behind the scenes. We will do exactly what we say we're going to do in the experiment, and so long as you're okay with that, you're on. If you win and you're able to prove beyond reasonable doubt that your powers actually exist, you will get $1 million. And basically what they set up is what's known as a random double-blind experiment, which means that neither the subject nor the people who are setting up the experiment really know what's there, and you're able to very quickly come up with a kind of statistical model that shows that you couldn't have got there by chance, or it was no different to chance. It was no different to chance among any psychic power, sorry. But if there's a marked difference between what you would be expected by chance and what would be expected by you doing it, then maybe further research. Claire in Blackrock Castle said, what about the Sceptics group in Cork in Blackrock Castle? And she said, yeah, great idea, and she tweeted it to the world. So before I knew it, I was locked into this thing. And I had to sort of come up with something pretty quickly. It was like the kind of a random idea that had come from this conference. And we had our first meeting in November 2010 with it was actually with Dylan Evans on alternative medicine. He was talking alternative medicine. I was expecting nobody to turn up at that meeting. I was going, this is going to be a really bad idea. But there was actually quite a few people turn up. It was about 18 or 19 people turned up at the meeting. And then we had other meetings. We had one on GM foods, and we had another one on moving statues. That just it was an absolute hit. I don't know, people turn up everywhere and talk about moving statues. So I would want, it's not I'm not a skeptic because I'm a particularly rational person. I don't think I'm any more rational than anybody else. I'm not a scientist. I'm not a particularly good engineer. I am an engineer. by training or by my university degree. But I wouldn't consider myself to be the best engineer in the world. I kind of left it as soon as I graduated. And I don't think, you might get this impression of skeptics are very logical people, you know what I mean? They sit down and they question everything and they're kind of, not the best fun to have. That would be the kind of the stereotype. But I think that it's something that I was very, very interested in. Skeptics seem to be interested in really weird stuff. That's the thing that really probably makes us different to a lot of people who are talking about football or even talking about, lots of stuff. It's just, a lot of skeptics that I know tend to be quite nerdy. They love kind of, talk. They love kind of different things, weird stuff, and then it's really a question of whether it exists or not. So a lot of it was kind of circumstances and interests that got me into this thing. Pardon? Face, yeah, that's right. Yeah, somebody looking down on me. Yeah. It's something that I find really, really, I'm still very, very interested in it. Irrespective of anything, I find it very, very interesting. I think there's a lot of people doing some very, very good work who don't get half the recognition for it. Because some of the things that they say are very unpopular, but some people are doing some great stuff out there, and it is a bit of a wake-up call. So I suppose the question is what are skeptics? And there's a big thing, and it's something that's kind of hit me once or twice. Is that a lot of people think skeptics are just a bunch of cynics. That's probably one of the biggest things out there is that a skeptic, we all just think everything's worthless, just everything's bullshit. No, they're comedians, skeptics. I think that where I don't necessarily subscribe to it, because I think a lot of people, when people are being cynical, sometimes they're not necessarily using that much evidence either for that. I'm not saying that we give cynics an awful lot of material. There's no doubt about that. We can burst. Skeptics can burst a lot of prized balloons. But I wouldn't necessarily call skeptics, people who are interested in skepticism cynical, because we are. It doesn't have to be a cynical exercise. I think you can get very cynical about lots of things and have your reasons, because sometimes in cynicism you're taking a position straight away, and everything that you're talking about or you're seeing tends to agree with that position or that viewpoint. But I wouldn't necessarily think that skeptics would be necessarily like that. And the other thing as well that we get is, you're very close-minded. What's that famous thing we get hit on, the Shakespearean thing, there are more in heaven and earth than can be dreamt of in your philosophy, you know what I mean? And that's quite an interesting one, right? Because, it's like we have no appreciation for stuff beyond our nose, beyond reality. And it's like, people say that, there's much more to life, why don't you be a bit more open-minded? But if you were to believe everything, right? What they're saying is a really open-minded person has to believe everything, you know what I mean? And then they have to reconcile all the huge conflicts between, believing one thing and then believing its absolute opposite, which is what the world is about. So when somebody says that, you're very close-minded, what they're really saying is you don't believe me, you don't believe my particular way of looking at something, which is a very, it's not close-minded, it's just saying, because that particular person might believe that levitation exists, or that flowers are running behind that they can speak to you and all this kind of stuff. But you know what I mean? They're not necessarily too keen on people who are believing in other things, right? So I just think that it says more about them very often than it says about a skeptic. It's a bit of a non sequitur. There's a very simple thing. Skepticism really is doubt in the face of, often extraordinary claims. That's really what it comes down to. Just doubt and suspended belief in what are very often extraordinary claims. And it kind of comes to this kind of idea of, how they call it epistemology. Kind of, How do you understand things? How do you know things? How can we know anything? This kind of big question, philosophical question. How can we know anything? And the original skeptics, I think, were people who basically said nothing was knowable. They just took this position that nothing was knowable. You couldn't know anything. It was too difficult to understand anything. And anybody who made a claim saying that this is true, the skeptics were at their neck, basically saying, well, you didn't think of that, you didn't think of this. And I think over the years it kind of became modified that, yeah, nothing is perfectly knowable, but some things are a little bit better knowable than others, Some claims are just a little bit worse than others are. And I don't think the idea really nowadays is that nothing is unknowable, everything is unknowable. I think what people are talking about now is that if you're to make a claim to reality, then there should be some sort of evidence to back it up. That's the bottom line. There should be something there, some evidence there to back it up. And if you're basically going, you're saying, well, there's no evidence, we've never really tried this before, we've never really done this before, that's fine. As long as you're honest about it. An awful lot of people make claims and they say, this exists, this particular phenomenon exists, or this particular phenomenon does not exist, and they don't back it up with evidence, proper evidence. And a lot of a lot of that is really where it comes to. And I think one of the other big things really is that science has been very, very good at putting in processes to try and know things as much as possible. But that's really the benefit of science. It's been able to take all of these claims and put them to the test. And it's been able to, very often put down very, very strict tests that are able to make us understand if something is unbalanced. It's been really, really successful at it. There's planes flying above us, there's satellites, there's medical procedures that are prolonging people's lives and helping babies to be born and all of this kind of stuff, because people have been able to distinguish the good ideas from the bad ideas. And that's really all we're saying. And I think probably the other thing as well that informs skepticism is a type of naturalism. It's kind of saying, we haven't seen the supernatural have very much influence in life over the last, in anything over the last, when it actually is put to the test, there's been no scientists who are kind of sitting together saying, God, yeah. Yeah, that definitely, let's write on the paper. We haven't seen that many kind of peer-reviewed papers that says, well, we put all the tests, we have to conclude it was God. That's the kind of the bottom line. It's still one of those things that we're trying to, that it does inform the outlook, and it does inform the way.
So science couldn't work otherwise.
Sorry?
Science couldn't work without naturalism in it.
Yeah, that's it.
It has to be testable.
And everything that's the great thing. It's the fantastic thing about science is that if you put in the effort and you really put in the effort, you put in the years, sometimes centuries, into trying to figure something out, the answer is usually really quite wonderful, but not necessarily not supernatural, but really quite wonderful, and it's still a kind of an ongoing quest to try and dig deeper and understand, the underlying causes. But there are very, very few scientific papers that go, hey, we've tried everything, it's definitely God or the Buddha or something like that, and that's really the bottom line. And I think that's it. We're being asked to believe lots and lots of different things, and really, and it's just that there's loads of different people can come up with loads of different ideas. They're great. It's great to come up with loads of different ideas, but the main thing is, can you test them against realities? How do we know that the world is round? How do we know it's not flat? It's not held up by infinite numbers of turtles? Those kind of things have been put that to the test. And we're able to figure out, this is actually the way things happen. And the other thing as well, I think, is the tendency people have of jumping to what are sometimes outrageous conclusions. And what I mean is that you see a light in the sky, and the immediate kind of thing is it's an alien civilization that has marched 500 light years from home and Earth. That's outrageous. What about the more? It could have been a Chinese lantern. Let's take off the more likely possibilities before you jump to something so outlandish as the idea of an ancient civilization jumping. There's all all this kind of stuff that clouds, birds, people, a lot of scientists said they've been hugely fooled by flocks of birds. Just in a different situation, you see a very, very tight flock of birds, and they just get it all wrong in terms of the distance that the birds are away, and they think, God, what is that? I've just seen something really, really strange. Ghosts as well, all of this kind of stuff, you know what I mean? That people will see something strange, or hear a door close, and they jump to this outrageous idea, you know what I mean? But it doesn't feel outrageous because we've heard it. It's so culturally embedded ideas. But when you actually think about it in terms of kind of logic, they are outrageous ideas. But they are culturally embedded, so they don't seem to be. And it's almost the default kind of reflection that people will say, oh yeah, it's definitely.
Didn't Carl mention the canals on Mars as being one of those issues where one scientist kept repeating saying that he saw canals on Mars through the telescope and nobody else could see it?
Yeah,
and yet it became a kind of a meme by itself where people thought it must be there. And yet, and it was just the light aspect. I think it was at the time. It was just the way it fell at the time he was looking at it. He couldn't repeat it. He couldn't prove it.
Yeah, but other people would then come up with their own different maps of Mars. And it's strange, lo and behold, none of the maps ever looked anywhere like each other. So yeah, and the alien stuff, the kind of big eyes, the aliens, and all of this. Very much kind of culturally embedded type of idea that it kind of goes to the heart of kind of what scepticism is. One of the other things as well that I find I'm very interested in, I know a lot of skeptics are interested in, a thing called logical fallacies. It's a logical fallacy is essentially a kind of a trick that people use to make you, not very often unconsciously, but it's a trick we all use to persuade each other of stuff, right? But sometimes it's a bad argument. It's just a bad argument. It's not necessarily not true, but it doesn't necessarily help your argument. It doesn't necessarily prove that your argument is true. And there's a couple of examples of logical fallacies. One would be an appeal to authority. So sometimes a dubious authority. So it would be something like, because the Pope says angels exist, then angels must exist. It's as simple as that, right? It's because Penelope Cruz says ear candling works, then ear candling works. It's that kind of stuff, and it's kind of, and sometimes it can be quite a sophisticated argument because sometimes there have been a couple of moon astronauts who have come back to the moon and have had some very, very interesting, strange ideas of the world. There have been some Nobel laureates who have won Nobel Prizes in physics and medicine who have also come up with some very, very strange ideas. And it's really a kind of like celebrity worship in some ways. If somebody says something, then it must be true. If Richard Dawkins says, X, then it must be true. If Enda Kenny says something, it's all that kind of stuff. It's literally just very, very much a default mode of the way we all work. Actually, we'll always kind of spend a little bit more time listening to what our parents tell us, or our grandparents tell us, or our best friends tell us, or our heroes tell us, and that is one of the things. But it doesn't necessarily. You then have to look at, well, what do they believe? The real question is, where are they coming from themselves? Because actually they could be wrong as well. Surprise, surprise. We're all human, and so that's one of the most common kind of logical fallacies. Is basically quoting somebody who you think should be the expert and should be able to answer everything, but may not necessarily be the experts any more than you might be. And the other one is the appeal to ignorance. And an appeal to ignorance is basically, because I don't know how it works, then it's impossible, it can't work. And the appeal to ignorance would be, because I don't understand how a monkey could possibly evolve into a human being, then evolution must not be true. And that's a very common one amongst the creationist community, is that they cannot conceive of any possible reason why, X, Y, Z, and it's just that they haven't read enough, they haven't studied enough, you know what I mean? You can't just throw it out and say, it's just a ridiculous argument. Sometimes ridiculous arguments in science are the ones that do work. It's rare, but it does happen. And, other people, because I can't imagine how burning fossil fuels can cause climate change, then climate change does not exist. It's a real case of using a kind of an argument from incredulity or argument from ignorance. It's, again, not a great example. There's also, of course, the appeal to consequences. That's the next logical fallacy, an appeal to consequences, which basically says, if you don't accept what we say, a very bad thing will happen to you. It's called bullying. But it's essentially saying, putting peer pressure on people to. The Galileo thing, I think, would have been the great one, where Galileo had said, well, I think it's true that the Earth goes around the sun. The court wrote in the Catholic Church said, think about that one again. And Galileo then said, okay, it doesn't go around the sun. You know what I mean? But I think it might. But it's that kind of thing where sometimes the peer pressure can basically influence that. And the opposite, of course, of an appeal to consequences. An appeal is if you believe this, then great things will happen. It's also called bribery. So one is called blackmail, the other one is called bribery. But again, they are common logical fallacies that are used sometimes to get people to change their views. Iraq, weapons of mass destruction would be one very good one. Weapons of mass destruction do exist in Iraq. And if they, think carefully about how you're going to answer that question. Another one then, as well, is called a post hoc rationalization or post hoc fallacy, which says that if something happened before the event, then it must have caused the event. It's effectively saying, that taking a whole load of possible consequences and dismissing all of them and saying that one caused it. And it's a very common one in the whole vaccine story, which you're probably aware of, where my child got an injection and then they started showing the signs of autism, which is widely considered to be a post hoc fallacy. It doesn't necessarily follow that the vaccine caused the autism, but because it's kind of culturally embedded, or it's a very, very strong belief among certain people, it becomes accepted. And there's a lot of kind of things like that where, and that's the beauty sometimes of science, where you can take all of the possible causes and you can start considering each one in turn and trying to figure out, did that really happen? And is there a correlation between X and Y? Is there a correlation? And if there is a correlation, that doesn't necessarily mean that X caused Y. And can we actually go into looking at situations where X should have caused Y and it didn't happen? So those kind of things are also very, 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 very strong, very prevalent in society. And the other one, I mentioned Galileo, but there's also the Galileo gambit, which is, and it's the gambit of the crank. The person who's got this great crank idea, that they basically believe that, pigeons have caused, have caused, the international food crisis or whatever. Apparently, physicists, a lot of people, physicists and professors in the physics department are often bombarded by papers from random members of the public, basically, completely denying relativity or, new theory of quantum mechanics, new theory, completely blowing away Newton. And they have this view that I am going to completely revolutionize thinking in this, and it's usually a straight, I'm sure they can fold it up into a paper plane, fire it at the dustbin. They get so many of them, right? And the Galileo gambit is saying, well, Galileo was proved wrong once, that all these great scientists, they had to fight the establishment and they had to come up with their own. They were going to get this reaction from the establishment. And not kind of, and it's kind of, and it's in some ways kind of in a warped way, it proves they're right, because I'm getting this, because
conspiracy concept.
Yeah, it's that kind of stuff. And they become even more secure in their thoughts that they've come up with the great new idea because, but that's actually, again, it's a complete irrelevance. And there's the world is, is littered with people with bad ideas, mentality is really is the default position. And I think So logical fallacies is one kind of big area that sometimes is hugely interesting. It's hugely interesting to know how we can be fooled. The other thing as well is just, I suppose it's just psychology. It's just how our minds work. 30 seconds and you look away, everything starts moving, everything starts shaking and wobbling and everything like that. Your eyes it's played a trick on your eyes. And so we hear auditory illusions as well. We hear something being said that wasn't said. We are influenced by people we admire. As I said, the whole authority thing, kind of a huge uncritical, they say your critical part of your brain just shuts down when you're hearing somebody that you have great, great admiration and love for. And then when you're hearing somebody who you bloody well can't stand, and you suddenly, your brain opens up, your brain closes down, and you can see all the problems and everything like that. It's like being in a bad restaurant, If you're in a bad restaurant, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this, or a restaurant, if something goes wrong early in the meal, then everything goes wrong. Everything. Like you come out of the place saying it's the worst restaurant ever. But again, your brain suddenly has basically gone into critical mode, and you're very, very negative about the place. And we are terrible at statistics. We've had a number of talks about statistics. Statistics is something we're not good at all. It's something that the normal thing is we tend to have a completely skewed kind of view of what will actually kill us, what actually is dangerous for us. Whereas, people don't like getting into planes, hate flight, a lot of people are very, very scared of flying, whereas the chances are really, really tiny, and they're going, I'd never get into a plane, You know what I mean? They're smoking away a cigarette, which is statistically much, much more dangerous for you, and so it's that kind of stuff that we tend to see things as coincidences, and that's one of the big things. Miracles. It's a miracle, and I was just thinking of my, long distance brother and everything like that, and suddenly he just walked around the corner, and it's a miracle. And an awful lot of miracles are statistical coincidences that are statistically possible. There might be small possibilities, but if you look at a world that's got 7 billion people on it, you look at a country like America with 300 million people on it, it means that there's a 1 in a million chance, there's 300 1 in a million chances every day. Something that would be really, really statistically improbable happens 300 times in America every day. It's enough to fill a newspaper and keep newspapers going for a while, or weird internet sites and stuff like that. We don't like being told we're wrong. Surprise, surprise. We hate being told we're wrong. We hate having to admit that we are wrong, and that causes a huge problem for people. To be, it takes an awful lot, sometimes a lot of courage to say, I really screwed up there, and it's just, again, it's something that there's a problem. We create false memories in our heads. We create this, we actually invent memories. Which again was we forget that things are we actually invent memories. And there's a couple of very good books that I've read where people have said, I swear it happened when I was a child. This particular sequence, this particular story happened. Everybody's going, I don't think so. So we actually, when we're remembering something, we recreate those memories, and that can be quite scary. So, sorry, the other thing as well is this overestimation of our abilities. There's a thing called a Dunning-Kruger effect that work we're looking into, where people who overestimate their abilities and they're not aware, they don't have the mental ability to realise that they're wrong. So, when you ask somebody, are you average or are you above average in this particular thing, something like 80% or 70% will often say they're above average. Really only a proper objective process that guards against all of these biases will help us understand something, whether something is worthwhile or not. And the process that is best at doing that is science. That's the bottom line. It's the good science will try and guard against all of those various different biases. So I suppose one thing about skepticism, why is it useful and important, and what's its use? Well, it's really there to kind of guard against false and very often dangerous claims, right? So, the MMR story has to be one of the great public health scandals and public health stories of our times. And it was all kicked off by a doctor, Andrew Wakefield, in the 1990s or early 2000s, who basically claimed or made the claim that the 3-in-1 MMR injection could be causing. The implication was there that it could be causing autism, and that his idea was that you should use just one injection at a time. It kind of reinvigorated an anti-vaccine movement which has been there ever since vaccines have come into existence. And it was a bullshit study. I'm sorry to use the word, but it was a terrible study. It was used in a birthday party with a very, very small number of children who didn't really know what they were signing in for. The parents didn't know what they were getting into as well. Very, very small number. It was extremely unethical, and the results were skewed to the results had very little to do with the methodology or with any kind of outcomes of the whole thing. But it was in the Lancet. It was published. It was the worst decision ever made. It was published in the Lancet, which is one of the top journals in medicine in the world. And it became, this is exactly what we said, and it kind of caused this huge roller coaster to happen, whereby huge numbers of people, lots of celebrities got on the bandwagon. Jim Carrey and Rod Schneider, the Jaws guy, and Jenny McCarthy, and all of these kind of famous people. They all got on the bandwagon, and they created this huge movement that basically said vaccines, the MMR vaccines, dangerous. And in fact, all vaccines are dangerous. And we've now had a situation where vaccine rates have dropped off. There was something in the newspaper recently. It said 28% of children in North Cork were vaccinated, the other group weren't. No, I have yet to see. I mean, that's a scandal if that's the case. I mean, it's amazing there hasn't been more reporting on that. And Swansea had a huge measles outbreak recently, where there was parents having to line up to vaccinate their children after having made a desperately bad decision not to vaccinate their children when they were young. Measles, no children should get measles nowadays. I mean, that's the only time children get measles is when the vaccination rates go down so much that suddenly, it's dangerous for children to get measles. It's a killer disease, it's statistically low. But if you say, 1 in 300 or 1 in 1,000 children will will die or get a very, very serious, lifelong injury as a result of measles, that doesn't sound much, but in a population of 1 million children, that's a very, very serious health crisis. Pertussis, which is whooping cough, has started to reappear over in the States and in other locations. Those old diseases are coming back, and these diseases that have been kept very, very much under control are suddenly beginning to reappear now because of the MMR story. And Andrew Wakefield is still running around telling reinvigorating the troops and telling them, do not get your children vaccinated. And we've got other people like Jim Carrey and Rod Schneider, and there's a ton more of them that are basically saying the same thing. Homeopathy. Homeopathy is water, and it's water, but it's also sold in a way that people believe that it's a powerful, potent drug, and the less of it you put in, the more powerful it gets. I don't know what that means, but the thing is that homeopathy is also being used as a way of moving people away from mainstream medicine, and that's the real problem with homeopathy, is that parents are not doing what they need to do for their kids, which is the best that medical science can offer. Medical science is by no means perfect, but it's basically moving them away and putting them on treatments that would be no better than sucking your thumb or drinking water. So homeopathy, dowsing. I also talk about dowsing. This is a relatively benign thing. If you're dowsing for water, great. There's only so much damage you can do. If you're dowsing for bombs, that's a different story. And there was a story in the newspaper over the last couple of weeks where a guy was selling dowsing rods to armies across the world that were meant to look for bombs, and in Iraq and in other kind of major war-torn areas. And the results were lots and lots of bombs inside in the capitals, of course, in some of those city centres, because they weren't using the proper techniques. And this guy made an absolute fortune of it, and it was a big panorama documentary, and he was using some sort of useless golf ball detector. He knew what he was doing, essentially. He knew what he was doing when he put these rods together. And somebody said to him, his alleged to have said to him, these things don't work, you know what I mean? And he said, of course they work, they're making me a lot of money. So, millions. He had a huge mansion as a result of those, and he's now in jail, I think. Good.
It's supposed to be working on something like a Geiger counter or something.
It's crazy stuff. You find diamonds under, thousands of meters of rock and all this kind of stuff. He was literally just, those kind of claims that are scary. Cults, again, I did mention that there's a guy here in Cork called John Diagnan, who was involved in Scientology for years. Now, I know cults are probably not as big news as they would have been back in the 1980s, but kids being indoctrinated into very fringe organisations that promise a cure for depression and mental disorder. And, if you're a normal kid, you're going through, you have good days and you've got bad days, and sometimes there's things that happen, and sometimes these groups can be very, very detrimental. Climate change is another huge one, and very often, efforts to limit CO2. The science is there. The scientific community has broadly reached a consensus about what's happening in the world with regard to CO2. It's just physics, John Tyndall, the guy whose name is on the Tyndall Institute here in Cork, was one of the first people to make a connection between CO2 gas and climate change, or CO2 gas and heating. And we're still 100 years beyond that, and the evidence has just continued to mount up and mount up and mount up. And yet, for political purposes, for political reasons, there has been a huge backlash against it. And it didn't seem as bad in the 1980s. It's now become a huge battle, particularly in America, and it's kind of completely regressive. So it's that kind of stuff, when there is so much propaganda being put out there, that it's stopping what we need to do. What the scientists are all saying. The scientists at the moment, there's a group called the National Science Foundation, and they've worked tirelessly for many, many decades against creationists, and basically presenting science as basically putting forward an science. Because creationists are always trying to get creationism put into the schools. And now they've added a new sphere of education, and that's on climate change, because they think that that's just as important and just as important an area. Nuclear power, GM foods, very often the scientific studies are not as clearly elaborated as what the activist groups would say. Psychics and assorted quacks, sending somebody to a psychic, to help over grieving. I just have huge misgivings over that, because the grieving process is hard enough without somebody telling you that your loved one is still looking at you and basically commenting on everything that you do, and it can extend the grieving period. The last resort cancer cures, I could talk about that for ages. Cancer cures, medicines and orange juice and vitamin C and everything that they use, and there's kids going through unnecessary suffering because of purported last chance cures. There's a guy making a fortune in the States. Families in Ireland and the UK and everywhere are going over in large groups, spending huge amounts of money and raising tons of money from very, very well-meaning people to fund these things. And there's absolutely not a jot of scientific evidence for what he's doing. And yet there are quite a few of these people. Cancer quacks are pretty reprehensible people, to be quite honest. It's one of those things that we all get touched by, and we would hope that the best science is going into the cures that are there. Chemotherapy, radiotherapy, horrible things to have to go through, but it's the best. They do work, unfortunately, in certain cases, and they have been certainly more effective than orange juice and vitamin C. Endangered species, rhinos are dying at an enormous rate in the world because certain people believe that rhino horn has magical powers. and witchcraft, which is another thing that is still in our world in a huge way. Not so much in the Western world, but in Africa and some parts of Asia, children are still being persecuted, sometimes killed, because there is a belief that they are witches. Albino children, old people, there's plenty of cases there. So that's really what Scepticism is all about. As I said, elephant in the room. I just want to talk a little bit, very, very quickly about religion. We didn't necessarily set up the club as being a kind of we want to poke holes in religion. I think that's kind of deliberate. Maybe that's where I come from. As I said, I was quite religious when I got into Scepticism. I prefer people just to, develop their own sceptical abilities and just to kind of, get more interested in that. And I think there's other groups doing a tremendous job in the kind of the religious area. And I think if people get interested in it, then they can pursue it there. There's not that we wouldn't do it. As I said, we've had people from we had the Scientologists in there, and we can also we've people talking about moving statues and stuff like that. So we're certainly open to that, but it wouldn't necessarily be an explicit view of the club. Just very quickly, Cork Sceptics. We've had a number of things. We've had nuclear. I was just talking about some of the subjects we talked about. Nuclear power. We had a brilliant, and it's up on our website actually. A very, very good talk by John McInerney, talking about the pros and cons of nuclear power in a more rational kind of way than just out and out screaming, this is a really, really bad thing. And in fact, nuclear power probably is, a more safer potential source of energy than coal and oil fired and fossil fuels. So it is something that still has a lot of strong views about it. And ghosts, we've had one on ghosts and psychics. We've had one on GM foods by Owen Lennox at the UCC as well. And we talked about this cancer quack Brzezinski and what he's been doing. And we've tried a talk on how we were really crap at statistics, 25% of us didn't like that. We had one from Marcin Strabinsky, who I think he's done on a lot of stuff on childhood learning disorders. He did one on kind of autism and that kind of thing, autism spectrum. And we've had one as well. We've had a lot of other ones. We had one on wine, we had one on modern art, we had another talk on body parts and how much each body part is worth. And we've had one on stem cell research. We even had one on the 17th century witch trials. So we've had loads of different types of things that we tried to have talks about. And they've all really been really interesting. It is kind of wide open to everybody. And that's one of the things that I like about the club. And often the people come in, I always ask the question, how many of you have been to a Skeptics meeting before? And I'm always amazed by the number of who've never been to a Skeptics meeting before. And it's usually 50% of the people there have never been to a Skeptics meeting before. So that's one of the things. It's a great place. Blackrock Castle is a great place, great facilities. We can Skype in people from abroad if we can't get them physically into the location. It certainly helps them on costs, and great staff and great assistance. And we've had kind of I've had a thing called 15-minute baloney detection kit, which was something I did for Culture Night last year, where every half an hour I did a talk on basic skepticism, basic things you need to know, even if you're not a skeptic, to help you kind of understand when somebody makes a strange claim what they're talking about. I also did something on First Friday, which was a thing about space and UFOs and why I think we need to take a lot of those claims with a pinch of salt. Just at the moment, I'm taking a little bit of a rest. I'm hoping to start up the next meetings maybe towards September, but maybe to try and think about what we'll do. So if any of you guys have any particular ideas, I'm really open to them as well. I've been doing this kind of constantly for the last 2 years now, and we've had pretty much one meeting a month. And sometimes I feel, the format, which I usually try and introduce, kind of news items and stuff like that, might be getting a little bit stale, or I need a little bit of energy. So I'm looking to kind of re-energize myself, rethink a little bit of what we do, whether the date is right, whether the time is right, whether the location is right, all of these kind of things I want to think about, and who else we can get involved in some of this, because if other people are very interested in skepticism, I'm really all ears. You know, I don't want to be the only person. I certainly don't want to be the kind of the only skeptic in Cork. You know, I don't think I am. By the way, there's one or two people there that are just great. You know, so that's it. I think I probably went on too long. You know, but if
could I apologise for having to leave a little early?
no problem.
Could I ask you a question?
Yes.
Before I go. I'm totally lazy about scepticism. I let other people do the research and so on.
Yeah.
Sometimes you meet somebody who's hung up on Medjugorje knows a name.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's proven that, you know, the
Yeah.
every day. Is there any definitive modern one that kind of takes these things one at a time and examines?
As in books on Medjugorje.
Or website or whatever.
Yeah, well, the internet is a great resource. Just put in the word that you want and put in the word skeptic, usually with a K, because a lot of it comes from America. But it's, you know, and then you will see something. So James Randi, there are some very good exposés on Medjugorje. There's a number of books you can buy on Amazon on Medjugorje. There are, you know, but the internet and Google is your friend when it comes to a lot of those kind of things. The James Randi Education Foundation usually has a lot of stuff. So if you put in JREF and whatever kind of subject you're talking about, you may see a forum, you may see some links, you may see some information that can help there as well.
So there's not one single publication but use the internet?
No, there's not one single publication. Again, this is an introduction to skepticism, or an introduction to science. This guy, Bill Bryson, everybody knows who Bill Bryson is. He wrote this book, A Short History of Nearly Everything, which if people are interested in just the scientific way of looking at the world in a very, very accessible way, he's a great writer. That's a great book to read. There's a ton of books on specialist subjects. I mean, this is Phil Plait. He writes the Bad Astronomy blog, and he's got a book on a lot of astronomy hoaxes. So sometimes you need to find the correct book and the right book. Skepticism is one of those things, you know, as I said, I'm a bad skeptic because I'm not, I can't quote you chapter and verse of anything that might be said. But somebody somewhere usually has the in on, you know, one particular angle. There are some very, very good guys who know all about alternative medicine. There's some other people who have done a lot of research on cults and a lot of research on religion. And you know, in terms of religion, some of the things, there's one or two Sunday World journalists. I think his name is Kennedy. I'm not sure exactly if I can find it, but he's done a big expose on the House of Prayer up in Ackle, which is a nasty piece of work. You know, the people involved there. But he's done a couple of exposés there. There is a guy called Mike Gard as well, who is an entertaining guy. He's done a lot of stuff on a lot of cults and stuff like that. He's done quite a bit on that as well. You know, sometimes there are people around. You know, if you've got a specific question, you know, you can ask me, and I can try and, you know, find out if I know of any further details and who might be the expert in those kind of areas. It's kind of the skeptical community is very small in Ireland, so it's one of those things you can usually ask abroad and you might find somebody else.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry again to have to
No problem.
appointment with the wife.
No, I have to go very soon as well.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So is there any other questions on that? I'm hoping I didn't go too fast.
I think that we also need to be more sceptical of science in terms of taking the claim of authority from scientists themselves, because that actually weakens the cause of science by overly trusting an individual scientist's claim. You have that a lot with creationists who they dress up someone in a lab coat and they suddenly claim that he's a scientist.
Yeah, that's right. I always compare, there's a book called Free Radicals that talks about how science really gets done, and it's messy. I often think it's like the Russians marching into Germany. It is just, despite itself, it gets it done. Sometimes they say science moves forward by funerals. You know, certain people have a very, very entrenched view, and they are very, very powerful in the scientific community around that particular area. And it's not until they kind of retire that the movement moves forward, that the knowledge moves forward. It's very true. You know, I mean, in medicine there's a thing called a Cochrane collaboration as well, which takes over. Doesn't take one study, it takes multiple studies that have been done and groups them all together in order to come up with a kind of and kind of identifies how good each study was, to come up with an overall consensus as to where the best thinking is on a particular subject. So the Cochrane collaboration is a great example of people, moving moving the knowledge forward bit by taking everything that's there and assessing whether there's something in a particular therapy or a particular cure. But certainly the hero worship is something you have to guard for. If it's just one person saying it, like Linus Pauling, who's a famous physicist, technology, for applying yourself to an extraordinary claim and saying, so I would tend to view science as well. If it's not science, what is it? So what other methodology are you going to come up with? And the previous methodologies have been, religious and theological, and they've been kind of, they don't have the same level of rigor, I suppose.
And we looked up skeptics last night on the internet, but what we got was the old original one.
Yeah.
Because we doubt everything.
Doubt everything, which again, I think
the argument I was making at all.
No. Yeah, I think it's. I think there's. I think no. Most skeptics would tend to say, science has given us all of this. We're able to put planes in the air and satellites in the sky, and we're able to cure people of various different diseases we couldn't have done years ago. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff that works and has worked, and people understand how they work, and you understand the principles. It's a bit like plumbing, and there's all these claims that and dilute the truth, not the truth, but they dilute, or they basically say something different. And sure, go ahead, it's tested. Let's see what happens, And if it's tested properly, and it proves itself over a period of time, then it's a worthwhile claim,
I've got a question myself, actually. Look at the QED.
Yeah.
Recently, and I was wondering what's going on in the skeptic movement at the moment. What were the highlights?
The highlights, I suppose, basically, it was very interesting. We had Richard Dawkins was talking. We were expecting him to be kind of pretty incendiary, because a lot of his messages on social media have been very incendiary over the last couple of years. But he gave a basically, he was talking more about evolution, the power of evolution, how it was. He actually made a claim that evolution itself wasn't as powerful an idea, as amazing an idea as what Newton had come across a couple of hundred years before Darwin. And the amazing, he says, the question is, why wasn't it Newton who came up with that? Why did it take another 200 years to come up with what is, when you understand evolution, it's kind of logical type of thing, it makes sense. He was, he gave a great talk. There was a woman, Brooke McGanty, who was a former sex worker. She was giving a talk as well about, sex is different to what, a lot of the kind of conclusions that we would have, or a lot of the views you would have about sex might be a little bit different in the real world, in terms of some of the research that's been done, differences between men and women, that seems to be quite an active area. Lawrence Krauss was talking about the beginning of the universe. We had another guy, whose name eludes me at the moment, who's talking about the search for life and the search for the origins of life on the planet Earth, and where life might go in the next couple of years with genetic therapy and genetic research. So he's done, it's Adam Rutherford, I think is his name. There was a number of talks as well on kind of skeptical activism and what skeptics can do to get the message out there a bit more. We had, trying to think now who else was involved. Stephen Colgan gave a talk about skeptical policing and some of the things that they use to try and stop antisocial behaviour, which is a fantastic talk. It was very, very different. Say it's 100% the opposite. And he was giving a talk. He wouldn't be a skeptical guy at all. And himself and Robin Ince, who's a comedian, got into a massive argument in one of the talks, because he was basically saying that skepticism is just another religion, and essentially that we were just full of all of he was just kind of an advanced form of hero worship, and it's just kind of the governments were now taking advice from scientists, and that was a really bad thing. that was one of its kind of central aims, that science shouldn't be involved in politics and involved in policy making. That politicians should be free to make their own decisions and their own choices. So you can imagine that. You can imagine that Robin Ince just absolutely lost it. He just got very annoyed about this, we had some talks about the anti-vaccination movement in Australia. Australia has done a great job in actually getting the message out there. The UK is doing a great job at the moment as well in really getting the message out there and saying, listen, anti-vaccination is dangerous. It's dangerous for your kids, dangerous for old people, dangerous for small babies who can't be vaccinated. These people are on ground. They're not on solid ground. They're on, they're talking off quicksand, but it all sounds very, very nice. Again, it's the power of story and the power of emotion. Who
are the anti-vaccination people? Like, are they religious? Or do they have?
They're not. No, it's very much kind of a new agey thing, right, more than anything else. It's they believe that you're injecting it's part of the naturalistic movement that you're injecting poisons. Anything natural, anything unnatural that's manufactured is dangerous, according to a lot of people. It's this naturalistic fallacy, where natural is good. That's the view, that if it's natural, they forget that deadly nightshade is also natural, right? That there's lots of, bee stings are also natural, that actually, a more rational view of the natural world is that it's out to kill us in some ways. That we've just invented, the human beings have invented tons of defences against nature. Because if we didn't have them, we wouldn't live very long. But that's very often the view, and vaccines obviously fit into that they're all unnatural, unnatural infection of your bloodstream, and it's all very, very bad for you. So that's it. We had a Carrie Poppy, very interesting person. She